David, good morning. Great seeing you again. Great that we could arrange this little chat. Now, you're an American journalist. That's your main day job. You worked most famously at the Washington Post as associate editor and as columnist, but you've also done some time with the Wall Street Journal. And I remember a couple of years in Paris with the International Herald Tribune. You have won many, many awards as a journalist. You've defended your independence as a journalist with all your might, and which I think is formidable. It's too long to list every award that you won, but two have struck me particularly interesting because they were given by foreign governments. The French government and the Italian government gave you awards for journalism. You've taught at Kennedy School of Government. You're a senior fellow at the Future of Diplomacy program. And something very near and dear to my heart, in addition to this day job, you've had the time to write several, last I count, 11 novels, which is something I absolutely admire because I've attempted to do the same thing different times. And some of your novels have been turned into movies. By the way, here in Armenia, you have a fan club you don't even know about because I have some very close friends who've read every single novel that you've written. And they would love to meet you one day. I said, okay, look, if we're both in Armenia one day, I'll try to make the introduction. But they've literally read everything you've written. But in addition to all this, I mean, I'm not going to even make a dent in all your achievements, David, in this short time. But I've ran into you at the World Economic Forum in Davos. I know you've had your share of diplomatic excitement at the World Economic Forum in the past. You've also been active in the Aurora Award ceremonies, where you've acted as Master of Ceremonies and so on. Now, we're going to come back to your achievements as a journalist, but I'd like to start with one aspect in your bio which says American journalist of Armenian ancestry. And you can imagine our audience would be kind of curious to know what that means exactly and what that specifically that means for you. What does this Armenian ancestry phrase mean? Let's start with that.
So I'm pleased to begin with that, with this audience, and I say hello to everyone, especially to you, Vahan, who I've known for so long. My grandfather, Hofsep Bohos Ignatiosian, as he was born in Harper in Western Armenia, came to the United States in 1903. He was part of a family that, living in Harpert, had been attacked by the so-called Hamidian massacres in the 1890s. And so they had left, and his brothers had preceded him coming to the United States. So he came to the United States in 1903 and went to a business college. He'd been to a missionary college in Harpert called Euphrates College, where he'd learned some English, gotten the beginnings of a good education.
Was that an American missionary college?
It was. So Euphrates College is one of those wonderful gifts, I think, that the United States gave to the Middle East, the Near East. We think of the American University in Beirut, the American University in Cairo, founded by missionaries in the 1850s, people who really believed in liberal arts education, in going to places where free education was not easy, and giving that gift. As you know, Vahan, there's a generation of politicians in the Arab world who were educated at the American University of Beirut. My grandfather, and really on both sides of the family, his wife's father also had been graduates of Euphrates College in their hometown. So my grandfather came, did various things in business, and eventually made his way to Los Angeles. And while he was there, he met the daughter of a very wealthy Armenian. The family name was Jamgocha. And I'll briefly tell your audience his story because it's a wonderful one. They had been living in this same area of Harput in Western Armenia in the Ottoman Empire. He was an educated young man. He was a poet. Among the many things he did, our family lore says, is he translated John Milton's epic Paradise Lost into Armenian, uh, which was quite a labor. Uh, but he also wrote poems as uh, freedom-loving people, Armenians and Turks as well, did in those days about freedom, challenging the Ottoman Empire. He was arrested. He had to bribe his way out of jail and ended up going to Constantinople, to Istanbul, where his family had a business importing and distributing textiles. He did very well there, and so he decided he'd move to Manchester, where the goods were made, and started a factory of his own, manufacturing the products and then selling them around the world. And that was very successful. And finally, he decided it was time to retire. He took a trip to America and he saw Glendale in Southern California, and he said, "This is like Armenia. This is high and dry, and the sun shines." So he built himself a beautiful house. His lovely daughter Elisa, who had been born in Armenia but grown up in Manchester, very much a Victorian young lady, met my grandfather Hofsep, who could charm the birds out of the trees. And so they married. Her dream at that time had been to make enough money giving piano lessons to move back to Manchester. She didn't really like America. So my father was born in 1920 in Glendale. Today, Glendale is the second Armenian capital, but then I think they were probably the first Armenian family, one of the first few. My dad went to the public schools there, and his father, my grandfather, had a rug business, which many Armenians did. He was very successful in the 1920s and then very unsuccessful in the Depression when America discovered wall-to-wall carpeting. And it was a bad time for a rug salesman. So my father is an extraordinary story. We just celebrated his 102nd birthday. And I hope many people in Armenia will think of him as a figure of some distinction in America. He was an official of the Kennedy and Johnson administrations and was finally Secretary of the Navy. He has a huge Navy destroyer named after him, the USS Paul Ignatius, which is now sailing in the Mediterranean. And he is the lucky man who's lived to 102 to see his children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. My mother passed away 3 years ago. She was not Armenian, so I have two sides of my family. But that briefly is our story. And I think the one thing I'd want to add to that, Vahan, is that for me, as an American growing up in this country, discovering my Armenian ancestry, understanding it, loving it, trying to find ways that I could connect with Armenia, with causes like Aurora, has been an important part of my growing up into being an adult myself.
That's incredible. I've known you for a while, David, but there are details here which I didn't know, especially about your grandfather. Your father is very famous. I know all about the ship, and that's a fascinating story. We're very, very, very proud to have him there as an Armenian, by the way, at that caliber. Let's move on to your journalistic career. And as a journalist, you've covered not only State Department, CIA, and Department of Justice, but also you've covered a lot of conflict areas globally. You've covered Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, the Iran-Iraq war, Syria. You've met many global political leaders. Now, you must have a very unique perspective on what's going on in the world today, especially with your access to Washington sources, but also your global reach. Things are changing, there's no question. From where I see, just let me give you why this is important right now for us, especially here in Armenia, but in general it's important for the world, it looks like, especially after the war in Ukraine, Russian influence globally is on the wane. Before that, for entirely different reasons, US influence was also on the wane, maybe waning in the Middle East. I could see that in all kinds of diplomatic gestures back and forth, maybe parts of Latin America even. And in this kind of situation where US and Russian influence is waning, it's interesting what's coming up, okay? What's filling the gap? To some extent, people talk about China. To some extent, I see Turkey's Erdogan very excited about filling part of the gap himself and repositioning Turkey. Of course, that will have serious repercussions or effects here in this South Caucasus in terms of the balance of power. It has many countries worried. How do you see the global geopolitical shifts and that are now quite significant, in my opinion?
Well, I think you put it pretty well, Vahan. We are at what people sometimes call an inflection point where you see a change in the overall balance. I think that Vladimir Putin has made a bad mistake, which will take Russia many years to recover from, in invading Ukraine brutally. But in the end, I don't think it's possible for him to succeed. It's just a question of what dimension the failure will be. And I think that poses problems for Armenia, which has had Russia, the Soviet Union, as its historic protector. And it alters the balance of power in your part of the world. Turkey, under Erdogan, is certainly seeking to take advantage of that. What I've been struck by most is that Ukraine is moving west and is succeeding in that. Ukraine's success in the battlefield is part of, I think, a broader de-Sovietization. It's a different country. It's strong. It's proud. It's determined. And I think that the Ukrainian example, the figure of Zelensky in his green T-shirt, has inspired Europeans, and I hope it's inspired Armenians too, to think that courage and determination do make a difference in the world. Sometimes we despair these days that the values that we feel just aren't strong enough to overcome despotism, raw power. But Zelensky is showing an inspiring face. And as I travel in Europe, in Poland, in Germany, even in France, I just think there's a kind of sense of that the very best of European values is being tapped here by Ukraine and Zelensky. And I hope that that's true in Armenia, that people feel inspired by this. You have a complicated set of issues. So many Armenians have lived in Russia, speak Russian, feel a deep sympathy for Russian culture. And yet, as you and I have discussed, the possibility that Armenia could move a little more toward the West, could have better relations over time with the United States and Europe, could in some way reposition itself, at least economically, so it wasn't quite as dependent on neighbors that did not, in the end, have good wishes for it. I don't just mean Turkey, but all of its neighbors.
Well, David, there are 2-3 aspects to what you just said. I was going to come to the implications for Armenia, but let's jump right into it. Seeing what Ukraine is doing and getting inspired by it, there's a very important issue here which Armenians don't find very easy to accept, and that is when Russia invaded Ukraine, the whole world, okay, the Western world, led by the US, but also Western Europe, also many other countries, jumped in and incredible both diplomatic and military and financial support for Ukraine. When Azerbaijan started an illegal war against Armenia back in 2020, nothing. So it was a very interesting situation for Armenia because here we are, a NATO member, Turkey, together with Azerbaijan, in agreement with Russia, were basically starting this illegal war while the countries were in the middle of peace negotiations, okay? And there's another side here which has gone into an extreme, which is very close to what you're saying. where there's one extreme faction that says, okay, Russia proved itself to be a totally unreliable ally, and therefore we should go now and start a relationship with the US. And there are questions. There are others who question the reliability of the West. I mean, you know, I know, there are some American allies which the US has kind of betrayed over the years in the Middle East. And there are specific examples in Iraq, Syria, the Kurds, Afghanistan, and so on. So it's not as if a blind, one-sided, single strategic alliance with either here or there is going to work. But there are these two elements. One is, why weren't we treated as Ukraine was? And second, does it have to be one or the other, or can we have a reliable alliance with the West in a balanced sense, in a strategically balanced sense?
So there are many questions there, Vahan. I think the first thing I want to say is that I really don't want to try to give advice to Armenians about their security. I don't feel competent to do so. I'm an American citizen. I'm a journalist. I need to cover all the world and do that as accurately as I can. The dilemmas that you're describing for Armenia's future are acute. You can just feel the point of them. But I fear that my advice would be simply that of an outside observer. I understand what you're saying. It seems unfair that Armenia gets attacked and suffers significant losses of territory and people in the 2020 war over Artsakh-Karabakh, and the world doesn't pay much notice. The United States did get involved diplomatically under the Trump administration, made efforts to help facilitate a truce, but that's not what the kind of support you're talking about. How Armenia becomes better known and understood in the world is a complicated question. Again, I couldn't offer advice, but I observe the need for greater contact and influence than Armenia now has. When I look at small countries that are vulnerable, it seems to me that the best strategy involves being active and useful in different directions, having multiple layers of support. I think of the United Arab Emirates, which has decided that after a period of depending totally on the United States, no, we're going to have relations with Iran, with China, with Russia. It may make people in Washington unhappy. That's what we're going to do. We're going to
even Israel. Yeah.
With Israel, they have an accord with Israel. They have relations with Erdogan, and have provided financial support for Turkey, which was a bitter enemy of the UAE just a year or two ago. So that's an example of how one country is solving the dilemma that's similar to Armenia's. The final thing I'd say is that whenever I look around the world, including at my own country, I realize that external security is a product of internal security, that a strong country internally that has strong laws, a strong democracy, strong leadership, that attracts investment, not as an act of charity, but because it's a good place to do business. That's where strength comes from. And so I hope that Armenia is focusing on that and becoming strong internally, and then almost inevitably greater external strength will come from that.
That's probably the best advice anybody can give. You said you are not positioned to give advice to the Armenian government, but there you go. You just said the key word. Get strong internally, and then the rest will kind of fall in place. It was a very, very interesting conversation, but you have the last word. If you have some final words about this, please.
Just to say, Vahan, that it's a privilege to be able to talk to Armenians to you, my old friend. But whenever I have a chance to visit Yerevan, speak with friends there, it's a pleasure for me. And as an American of Armenian ancestry, I watch everything that happens in Armenia with a sense of hope. And when there are good achievements, it's a great sense of pride. So it's holiday season here. We'll have Thanksgiving tomorrow. We're thankful for the good things in life, and I hope for a happy Thanksgiving for Armenia.
Happy Thanksgiving to you, David. Great chat, and I look forward to seeing you here in Armenia one of these days. Maybe in the spring. It's too cold now already.
For sure.
All right.
I look for that too, Vahan.
Thank you. Thank you.